Welcome to our final Center for Preaching event for the year, which is Book Bites. We've been biting on some food here, and today we're going to chew on the concept of preaching points. And as we begin, I'd like for you to listen to one. If you've not listened to a preaching point, Angus is going to play it for us.
Make the big idea the big idea. Well, welcome to the Preaching Points podcast for this week. I'm your host, Brian Haddon. And this week we have Dr. Haddon Robinson pointing us to keep the big idea the big idea.
We talk about the big idea here at Gordon-Conwell Seminary. The big idea is the dominant idea in your sermon. It's made up of asking two questions. What am I talking about? And what am I saying about what I'm talking about? And we try to crystallize it into an idea that addresses people in the 21st century. What is important is to realize that in a sermon, that idea is what has to come through. Sermons have all sorts of ideas. If you think about it in terms of an outline, you have Roman numerals, and they're all ideas. And then under the Roman numerals, you have A, B, and C. They're all ideas. And maybe under A, you have a 1 and 2. They're ideas. But all of these ideas come together to get the central idea in your sermon to come across to your listeners. If you want to put it this way, the big idea of good preaching is preach the big idea. I'm not talking about minimizing what you do in your sermon, but I am saying the introduction begins to lead to that idea. The supporting material, the Roman numerals, are Roman numerals that support that idea, and the conclusion drives home that idea. People learn by ideas. Very few people will ever be able to duplicate your outline a week after you give it. In fact, if you ask your wife what you preached about a week ago, you may find that it puts a strain on your marriage. But if you can take that idea and drive it home, show people where it comes from in the Bible, show people how this relates to where they live today, then illustrate it, apply it, make the big idea of your sermon. Work at it. You'll find it's more effective. People can't handle a whole bunch of ideas that seem unrelated, but you'll give them something to live by, something to die by, if they have ideas that control their lives. The Bible is a book of ideas. Oh, it has poetry, it has narrative, it has parables, it has literature, but it is basically a book of ideas. All of these different genres are getting at an idea. So as you preach, you ought to know what that idea is in the text and what it is for your people. And then drive it home. Nail it into their minds and into their lives. The big idea of good preaching is preach the big idea. I hope you're doing that, and I hope you'll keep on doing that.
And that was Dr. Haddon Robinson with this week's Preaching Point. Well, thanks for listening to the Preaching Points podcast from the Center for Preaching at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. Every week we try to offer brief reflections on preaching that will point you to preaching excellence. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the big idea, please order and listen to Pulpit Talk Volume 4. Volume 4 of Pulpit Talk will help you clarify the big idea in the text and in your sermon. Visit gordonconwell.edu/Ockinge/CFP for Center for Preaching for more information about Pulpit Talk, and look for Pulpit Talk Volume 4. Well, I'm Brian Haddon. Thanks for listening this week to Preaching Points.
several years ago when we established the Center for Preaching, one of the initiatives that we were wanting to develop was a podcast type of outreach. And what better way could we do that by doing a very brief, one idea-oriented podcast every week, which modeled in many ways what we were trying to do in preaching. Instead of bombarding people with a flurry of ideas, give them one idea to hold on to. And so that birthed our Preaching Points podcast. And it's been going on now for several years, and we have each week thousands and thousands of people who download the podcast. Well, that voice you heard was Dr. Robinson's voice, and many of you, that might have been the first time you've ever heard his voice, but he was a dominant voice here for 22 years as he served as the Harold John Ockengay Distinguished Professor of Preaching. And working with him, as I did for those years, was an incredible privilege. Later on, Dr. Jeff Arthurs joined our team, and we brought him into these discussions in the Preaching Points podcast. And then Dr. Patricia Batten was also brought in as well, as she is our ranked adjunct assistant professor of preaching. When we got word that Dr. Robinson had made the decision to retire, our search didn't go any further than Dr. Matthew Kim. And we brought Dr. Kim, and then he, of course, is involved in the Preaching Points podcast. But one of the things that we were asked about was, do you have any of these podcasts in print? And we, of course, didn't. There are hundreds of them. And so how do you choose which ones to put into print? So I was in conversation with Jim Weaver, who's a new publisher. Jim had worked at Kriegel, had worked at Zondervan. I even think he worked at Baker, but he set up his own press called Weaver Books. And they have been publishing books now for the last few years, and a lot of the books have focused on preaching. And so I was in conversation with him and asked him if he would be interested in publishing the Preaching Points book. And he jumped at it. He said, that's what I'd like to do. And so what we did was to assemble preaching points from the different contributors to Preaching Points. Dr. Robinson had retired, and so I selected them for him. And then we had each of the contributors provide, I need that deal in a minute. Each of the contributors to provide a selection of their own podcasts. So Dr. Kim here was one of the folks. Let's talk about how you went about finding the ones that you decided to put on the list for the book.
Well, being a new faculty member, I didn't have that many to choose from, but they were in many ways self-selected for me. But I'd like to talk about how do you come up with a point?
Yeah.
And that's actually really challenging. You think about it, you think, and we don't record these every single week. We try to cluster them. We might do a few at a time, 4 to 5 at a time. And it's really like figuring out what you're going to preach on. If you're an extemporaneous preacher in terms of sermon selection, I had pastor friends who they wouldn't know what they would preach the next week. They would just pick a verse or pick a topic. And I'm not recommending that by any means, but that's kind of how it seems to write a preaching point. What do preachers need to know? What would encourage them for a week, what would they chew on, think about in their own preaching ministry? So I just tried to think about different aspects. The text, talk about listeners, some of it's both. So those are some of the...
And some of the things that help to contribute to selecting and developing a preaching point is through our reading. We'll be doing some reading, and something will come out in the reading that enables us to say, you know, this idea will be a great idea to encourage pastors. Because one of the things that we want to do is keenly to encourage pastors and to help preachers be excited about, thoughtful about the ministry of preaching. And so we have been doing this. Have we covered topics over again? Maybe we bumped into different topics, but we've really covered a lot of different topics over the years and have had these preaching points in our back pocket. We have a list of points that we will record in the future. So it's there. If you have any that you would like to share with us, we'll use them. But the book itself is published by Weaver, and it has the same design that we have on the website, designed by Nicole Rim here at Gordon-Conwell. And the publisher came up with 55 tips for improving your pulpit ministry. We're just going to call it preaching points, but hey, add a little splash on there, maybe a bow and a little whipped cream and a cherry on top. And so once I got the different preaching points from each one of the authors, I went through them and edited them, tightened them, and then I arranged them in the book, sprinkling different ones throughout, thematically dealing with them so that there is some kind of unity, flow to the book itself. And so these preaching points from Robinson and Arthur's, Batten, myself, and Kim are there, and we dedicated to you, to our former, present, and future students, that they preach faithfully God's Word. And we hope that this book is one that will not only help preachers, but encourage and strengthen them in what they do. But maybe you have some other comments, questions that we could talk about.
I'm just thinking about when I first started out as a preacher in 1999. I think this book really touches on a number of questions that I was asking myself as a beginning preacher. And it just solidified some of the things that I needed to be reminded of or taught and learn about the task of preaching. And as we all know, preaching is challenging. It's something that we commit to the Lord for the Spirit to do the Spirit's work in and through us, and it's a humbling activity every single week trying to put a sermon together. But what are the things that pastors think about in their own sermon preparation? What do they think about as they're preaching, the act of preaching? What is it that they think about afterwards? So those are the types of things that we're trying to address in the sermon, in the book, that we can hopefully share with all of us.
Yeah, and so what we've tried to do is take selections from the preaching points that cover a broad approach to preaching. It doesn't cover everything, and certainly the podcasts themselves can be listened to. They're on iTunes U, and hopefully going to be put into some kind of app at some point in the future, but we'll see, for even wider distribution. But we're just so grateful to be able to put this book together and also to continue Dr. Robinson's legacy. Dr. Robinson has been a significant leader in the field of evangelical homiletics, and one who has had a great impact on my life and my preaching. And I know Dr. hymns as well, and the others who share in this volume too. And so we wanted to be able to continue his legacy by helping people to see the importance of good, solid, biblical preaching based on the idea of the text. So, do you have any questions or engagement with us about the book, the concept of preaching points? Yes?
I have one very non-serious question. Do you know when you will
No, we don't generally. It's a conversation. So we have an idea. We know that this is what the idea is, and then we talk about the idea and then land the plane emphasizing the idea. So, yeah. There's no script, if you're asking that. No script. Mine.
Yeah, yours.
Yeah.
SMG.
Yeah.
It says SMG.
Yeah. I have to say that I really am always encouraged, inspired, challenged by Dr. Robinson's work. And he was a master at words, at putting people at ease. You could hear him having this sweet conversation with us as preachers as we overhear what he has to say. So it was a delight for me to be able to work with the manuscript of his podcasts and to hardly do any work to it in terms of tightening it up because they were so well done. Because what we ended up doing is most of these were transcribed and then from the podcast itself. And since it's a conversation, as we mentioned, Kyle, some things needed to be tightened up. How about you? Your favorites? Yes?
Well, I like Dr. Arthur's adapted gender lex. I think that's something that we don't really talk about, and you can read more about that in the book. There's some interesting ones here, like remember the ERP factor. What is that? It just gets us to think about preaching in different ways. Number 41, gentleness isn't for wimps. There are all kinds of different topics, and I think they'll hopefully help each of us to think about preaching from a different angle.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Did you all sign up for, we have some books we're going to give away, so it's, yeah. Don't trip there. It's over on the counter. There's a basket.
Other questions?
Other questions?
I'll ask one. With all the tips and ideas about good preaching, how do you, maybe if you're in another church, you're hearing someone preach, how do you keep in mind you're sitting there thinking, oh, we should read point number 37? How do you keep that good critical engagement and still cultivate respect and humility?
You know, I listen to I don't know how many sermons every semester, and some of them are wonderful, and some of them are needing some improvement. But when I go to church, I really honestly have taken off any kind of mask that I wear or hat that I wear, and I'd really try to be blessed by the word preached. And I may make a side comment to myself, but here and there. But in general, I really just say, Lord, bless me, and I want to be a blessing. How do I receive this word? What do you want to teach me?
I usually say, Lord, help me. I'm constantly, it's hard for me to turn off. I have to be very honest about it. Because if the structure doesn't make sense, doesn't logically flow, then I can think about everybody else in the congregation who's not getting it because things don't flow in a way that they're going to be able to apprehend them. And so clarity is a key concept for me. And if a sermon isn't clear, I really have a hard time with it. Because the word itself, read, is usually very clear. But what happens is that the pastor, preacher, fogs it up. And then that's just not right. So I have a hard time turning it off. And that's just the nature of, I've listened to thousands of sermons, student sermons and other preacher sermons. And so I'm constantly thinking, okay, is this based on the text? How is this based on, is this clear structurally, and all that stuff goes on in my head. But that doesn't mean that I'm not challenged by it, blessed by it, encouraged by it. It's just that that's the way my mind thinks. So I'm not as holy as Dr. Kim in that regard. I'm much more of a sinner. So, yeah.
Dr. Kim, you were mentioning how when you were a young preacher, working in the pulpit, you had questions, and some of these tips might have addressed those questions. I was wondering if there's any way that preachers have or can engage with pulpit topic of
Preaching point?
ask questions or engagement. Is that something that has happened? Or?
I'm sure it can. It hasn't very much.
Occasionally we'll get emails from listeners, but most of the time what we do get appreciative emails saying thank you for doing this ministry. In fact, we've actually even gotten students to come to Gordon-Conwell who heard preaching points in their home countries. So it's been really quite an interesting outreach for us as a seminary. Something.
Thinking about the challenges that preacher faces every week while you live with it. Have the two of you ever wish you were back there, getting up preaching every Sunday?
I do.
How do you deal with that tension between being here and picking up and wanting to be preaching full time?
It's a different calling for me and for him as well. I really miss preaching every Sunday. So if any of your churches would like to invite me, I'd be happy to preach. But the opportunities aren't as many. Sometimes I'll preach 3 times a month. Sometimes I'll preach 0 times a month. So I miss it. I miss the consistency of it. And I miss pastoring and loving people in different ways. So, but my new ministry is to encourage and equip people who are in ministry and going to be ministers. So it's a different calling. And I treasure what I do now as well.
Yeah, I do miss it and miss the people, especially working with people, speaking to a particular congregation. That's something that, as far as itinerant ministry, it's very difficult to do. But what I try to do is, before I go to speak at a given congregation, is to find out about the church, what are the issues, needs, what have you. Sometimes I'm asked to preach as part of their series. So we're going through Ephesians. Can you preach on? Sure, I'll do that, whatever, and I'll fit into the flow of what they would like for me to do. Or occasionally, I'm just asked to preach on whatever, but I'd like to find out a little bit more about them. I just came back from being at a pastor's conference in the Peoria area and preached to pastors who are in rural church settings. And it was an incredible experience. And I pastored in rural churches, so it was very easy for me. I told them that they were my tribe because it was just great to be able to be with them. and to speak to them to where they are, because I know what it's like. I pastored in a town of 1,200 people. Everybody knew who I was. I didn't know everybody, but they knew who I was. Go to the drugstore, Marie's sitting there flipping through her papers. Oh, Scott, your deodorant's on sale. And I didn't even know she knew what deodorant I wore, but she wanted me to save some money. And so, but that was just part of the small town mentality, and I miss that. I miss that. So there are aspects of pastoral ministry that I dearly miss. There are other aspects of pastoral ministry I don't miss at all. And I just have to be honest about that. Now, Dr. Kim might be more saintly than me, and he misses every aspect of
Not every aspect.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there you go. So, but yeah. But even for me, my sense of my calling is to do what I'm doing here now. And I'm so grateful, though, for the experience that I had in pastoral ministry full time. I've done some interims as well that have been good experiences of preaching regularly, but it's not like being there full time. And you sow yourself into people's lives.